Good morning and welcome to Rose Red Homestead. Today we're going to be starting our series on first lessons in bread baking. I'm really excited about this series. We have several videos already on making artisan bread, but artisan bread is a little bit more complex and it takes longer to do, and you're more likely to have success with that if you are already an experienced bread baker. And so I have been thinking over recent weeks about the life change that it has made for many of us to have gone through this past year with the disruption of COVID. COVID has taught us a lot of things. It's taught me a lot of things. And one of the things that I have learned is that disruption is becoming the new normal. We even have a new event in the news right now with that ship that is stuck in the Suez Canal. And so we're going to be seeing the impacts of that in prices that are going to be going up. Things are going to become scarce again for who knows how long. The last article I read was they expect that to be months before they can get that ship dislodged. I hope it doesn't take that long. And so as individuals living all over the world, knowing that disruption can happen in a split second and can even shut society down, we've experienced that. How do we stay prepared? What can we do even if we are living in an apartment or a mobile home that does not have a lot of extra space? Well, that's one reason I wanted to have this series, because one of the things that we can do is that we can learn how to make our own carbs. And carbs are a staple of our diet. We could survive if all we could do is bake bread, have enough bread. And so in our home, I have a year's supply of the things that it takes, the ingredients that it takes to make bread. So I would be able, in a disruption, to make bread for our family and probably for our neighbors and friends nearby for a year. And so I have a year's supply of flour, I have a year's supply of yeast, of sugar, and everything that is necessary for a plain and simple loaf of bread. So we are going to get started on this very simple way to make bread that I hope will help all of us to realize that we can do this, and we'll get started in just a moment. There's all kinds of fancy equipment out there for potential bread bakers. Little machines that will just do it all on its own pretty much. But from my standpoint, I think we need to know how to do it. For instance, if the grid goes down. We're first going to talk about the equipment that is needed for bread baking, and then we'll go through the ingredients. And I just want to say right as we start that a lot of people say, you'll hear this a lot, that, oh, bread baking is so easy. Well, you know, easy or hard, it's all relative. Things that I think are easy, other people think are very difficult. And so I'm not going to say it's either easy or it is hard. What I am going to say is that baking bread and coming out with a good loaf is more than it seems on the surface. It is very nuanced. And so that's what I'm going to share with you today, is the nuances of making bread so you can be successful. So let's take a look at the equipment. I have some things laid out here. Pretty much all you need is a bowl and a spoon to mix the bread up. Now, many of us, including me, I have a KitchenAid mixer right over here, a stand mixer that has a bread hook. And I've made hundreds of loaves of bread using that KitchenAid with the bread hook. And if you have one, great. This recipe will work for that as well. This is the recipe that I have made my good old stand-by white bread for years and years and years. And it is very adaptable. So, a bowl and a spoon. Then you will need a pan to bake it in. Now, I want to talk about pans for just a second. I went to my cupboard. I have a whole stack of bread pans that I've collected over the years. And I can tell you the pros and cons. If you have not yet made bread and are going to be buying a couple of loaf pans to make bread, here are some clues. They're available in glass, they're available in metal, and pretty much they're available in 2 sizes. So, glass. I never use glass for baking bread. I use it for making meatloaf, I use it for other things, but I do not use it for baking bread. It does not give the kind of crust that I really like, and it doesn't darken as much as I would like for it to. So I'm just going to set this one aside. Next we have these 2 sizes. Now these are about 4.5 by 8.5. Here's a dark pan, here is a light pan, and these are probably 30 years old, and they're looking like me, a little bit aged. But I'm going to show you why this is a better choice in color than this is when we get to down the road here in just a minute. This is a 5 by 8 size pan. This one is probably about 30 years old. And last week, knowing that we were going to be making this video, we had a brand new grocery store open up just about 5 miles down the road from us, and we are so excited because it is a really nice grocery store. And so we went to the grand opening, and Jim bought me 2 brand new pans. These are 5 by 9 pans, and that's good because this recipe makes 2 5 by 9 loaves. And this is the best bread pan I have ever had. This one works just fine too, but notice the ones that I always migrate to are the dark colors. And there is a reason for that. And again, I'll get to that in just a minute when I show you some loaves of bread here in just a minute. Then the other things that you're going to need: a measuring device that measures liquids, one that will measure flour, dry goods, and then a set of measuring spoons, and an oven to bake it in. And that's all. That is all you need to make bread. So I'm going to go off camera for a minute and set up the ingredients, and we'll go over the ingredients. Before we get to ingredients, there are 2 more pieces of equipment that, while they're not absolutely necessary, they really do help if you want to have these. The first is a little thermometer that you can measure the temperature of bread dough, or I use it for measuring the temperature of water, which is pretty critical. And so that's one. And the other one is this barbecue thermometer that Jim uses out on his Traeger. And this is what I use to poke in the bread when it is in the oven to be sure that it is done all the way in the middle. There are workarounds for these 2, and I'm going to show those, but these are just nice tools to have if you want to spend a little bit of extra money on those 2. You can make bread with 4 basic ingredients: flour, water, salt, and yeast. And that's a perfectly wonderful loaf of bread. And what ups the flavor of that is the fermentation part of the yeast, which I'll get to in just a moment. Now, let's start first with flour. Right here I have 5 different flours set out. These I just pulled out of my cupboard. And so which type of flour is best for bread? So here we have pastry flour. Pastry flour is great for making pies and cakes and even pie crust. It's very light. It does not have as much protein as some of the other. This is not suitable for bread. This is self-rising flour. It already has a leavening agent in it, baking powder. We don't want to mess with that at all. It's going to mess up our yeast. And so that is not suitable for bread. These 3 flours you can use for bread. This is just regular all-purpose bleached flour. This is probably the most common flour that is used for bread, widely available in grocery stores everywhere. Then we have these 2, and these are both King Arthur, and these are unbleached bread flour. Notice that it says that it has 12.7% protein. That is high protein for bread, and it's great. The unbleached part and the high protein makes this a great flour for bread. This is my #1 most favorite flour, and it is unbleached. It's comparable to this one over here, except that it is unbleached. Now it has 11.7% of protein, which is still very high. This is the flour that we are going to use today to make bread. This is what I usually use to make bread. I bought this some time ago. I haven't even tried this one yet, but I will. But both of these, and including this one, are good bread flours, and I just prefer unbleached because they have a little bit more nutrition. Now, the second thing is yeast. Yeast can be really tricky if you do not understand the science behind yeast and what it does. First of all, yeast is a living organism. It is a fungus. It's related to mushrooms. And so maybe some people don't realize that. But it also, when you first buy it, it starts off being really viable. But the longer you keep it on the shelf, the more it loses its viability. And after a while, it won't do its job anymore. And there's no resurrecting it. And so when it gets to that point, you have to throw it out. And I'm going to share a story with you in a moment when we look at the loaves of bread that I have to display. Now, here is how yeast works. First of all, when I first started making bread when I was like 12 years old, and that's more than 60 years ago, the only kind of yeast that we could get was in a little cake. Some of you may remember that. It was very moist. It was wrapped in foil. You had to soak it in water for a long time to make sure that it was all dissolved before it would start working. And then they came out with active yeast. And they had taken that little yeast cake and dried it out and crumbled it. And so it's in these little, what would we say? There's little granules. And that was active yeast, and it dissolved much faster, but we still had to put it in water and make sure that it was all dissolved, and the water had to be a little bit warm. And now we have instant yeast. This is the only yeast that I use, instant yeast, because now we don't even have to dissolve it in water first. I can just throw it in with the flour and then add the water when I'm ready to add the water. It is amazing. It has revolutionized the way that I make bread. It has saved time. And so this is what I have a year's supply of. And there are several brands of this. I just use the SAF Instant. Now, when you are shopping for yeast, what you need to do is you need to look for the word instant. Don't mistake active dry yeast for instant dry yeast. The active dry yeast is the larger granules, and you will have to dissolve those in water. The instant is what you can use without dissolving in water. So here's how yeast works. Because it is a living organism and it is now in a dormant state, the minute that we add warm water to it and give it a little bit of food, in fact, the scientific name, which I will not bore you with because it doesn't matter anyway, but it means sugar eater. And that's exactly what happens here. This yeast immediately begins digesting sugars. And the sugars, we can either give it regular sugar or we can give it flour, because it can convert part of the flour into the sugar and starch that it needs. And once it starts digesting, it produces gas, carbon dioxide. And what that carbon dioxide does, as that gas starts coming out of the yeast, we have developed the gluten in the flour, and the gluten strands create this webbed network all throughout the bread. And with the yeast in the network here and giving off the gas, what happens within those little gluten compartments is they blow up like a balloon. And that is what causes our bread to rise. And also, one of the byproducts that is given off through this process is a little bit of alcohol. And that alcohol is what gives it that yeasty smell. When you walk in the house and someone is baking bread, that smell that is wafting all through the house, that is that alcohol that is a byproduct of yeast digestion. And so it is critically important that your yeast is fresh and still working. And I will show you an example of how I know when my yeast is shot and ready to throw it away. So those are the basic ingredients that we need to be concerned about. Let's examine some baked loaves of bread to see exactly what it is that we're looking for. So a loaf of bread pretty much has two parts. It has the crust all around, and then when we cut into it, That is called the crumb. And we want to examine both so that we know what we're looking for. Now, this is a pretty good loaf of bread right here, except that the top is a little bit wrinkled because one of the things that I do, sometimes I put butter on the top and sometimes I don't. I put this in a plastic bag a little bit too soon and it got moist on the inside, and so the top wrinkled. The bread that we take out of the oven today should not have that. But other than that, this is a pretty good looking loaf of bread. Now notice that it is done all over. It has nice color all the way around, top and bottom. And notice the seam right here. The pan came up to here, and there's no separation. It's still connected right here. Right here. Now here's a little bit of pulling away, but other than that, it's pretty good. So let's examine these four right here to see how well they fit, and then we'll open up one and take a look at the crumb on the inside. So first of all, I just took this one out of the freezer, so it's still frozen. Look at this one in comparison with the rest. What do you notice? Well, if you said that this one is smaller, you are absolutely right. Other than that, it has really good color. Here's a little bit of separation right here. Doesn't affect the taste at all. We're still going to eat this. Over here on this side is better, but it's flat. It doesn't have the rise to it. Because I have been baking artisan bread for the past 4 or 5 years, and that's a totally different process, I kind of lost my touch with my good old standby recipe, and I was practicing to be sure that I could do it for today's video. And this was the first batch that I baked, and this immediately told me, guess what? My yeast was shot. And so I threw away the rest of that whole package. I opened up, I keep my spare in the freezer. I have a couple in the freezer. And I took one of those out, and look at the difference. Same bread recipe, same pans, same oven temperature, but the yeast in this was shot. So pay attention to that. Now, what about this one? What's your judgment on here? Well, boy, it's puffed way up, but there's a reason for that. This recipe is for 2 5x9 loaves, and I have this dough in a 4.5 by 8.5 pan, and look at the color of the pan. Does that have any effect on the outcome? Yes, it does. And so that's why darker pans are so much better for baking bread. Now, when I measure the temperature of the bread, I just poke that Jim's barbecue thermometer right into the center of the bread, and it should read 200 degrees. This one was cooked in the very same oven as this one, and this one was at 200. This one was at 180. Same oven, same batch. And yet, look, it looks just almost not done. One of the big mistakes that happens when you bake bread is that it is underbaked. I decided on purpose to pull this. I could have taken this one out and cooked this longer, but the top would always be much browner. Also, look at the separation here. And so that's not good either. Now I'm going to cut right into the middle of this one because I'm very curious to see the crumb to see if it got done in the middle. Okay, so a couple of faults with this. First of all, here's a big hole, which means that it rose too fast in the oven. And this center is gummy. It does not spring back nicely like it does here. This is gummy. And so it did not get done in the middle. And that's really an important consideration. Now, if you don't have one of those thermometers, then there are ways around that. You just be sure that you cook it long enough. Some people say, well, it should sound hollow. Well, when it comes right out of the oven, this one sounded hollow. So sounding hollow does not necessarily mean that it is done in the middle. So you want to take a look at the degree of brownness all the way around, and then make sure that you have kept it in the oven at least 40 minutes. And then if you want a browner crust or a nice crunchy crust, you can even leave it in a little bit more. So now let's take a look at this one. Cooked in the right size pan, nice brown all the way around. There's a little bit of separation here, no big deal. here as well. But what do you see? It is uneven. There's a hump here and not humps here and a little valley right here. Now, it doesn't affect the taste. We're going to eat this anyway. But if you are striving for perfection, this is one thing that you want to work on. And so this one, other than the fact that the top got wrinkled in the plastic bag yesterday, you can see the hole right there where I stuck the thermometer in to be sure that this one was done. So let's check. I'm not going to go into the middle of this one, but I'm going to cut in a little bit right here. So let's check what the crumb is. Okay, this crumb is beautiful. Pretty much nice even bubbles, a little bit larger at the top, no big holes. This would make a great sandwich. And so this is the kind of a crumb that we are going to be looking for. A couple of big holes, larger holes here, but not anything like the other one there. And it springs back nicely when you touch it. And so it's done all the way through. So this is what we're aiming for. So let's get started, for heaven's sake, and get it done. You might want to grab a pencil and paper for the ingredients and then just watch for as we do the process. And that's when I'm going to be explaining the nuances as we go. So first of all, the first nuance is, I don't know what kind of flour you are going to use. Every flour is different in terms of the amount of liquid that it can absorb. And so the first thing that you need to know to do in good bread making is don't start with the full amount of flour called for in the recipe. Now I'm going to give you my full recipe, and then I'll show you how I make adjustments according to what is happening in this kitchen the moment that I'm making the bread. So this is 6 1/2 cups of flour, 2 tablespoons of yeast. We're making 2 loaves, so I'm putting 2 tablespoons of yeast. If you're going to buy yeast in the 3 little attached packets, it takes all 3 of those to make 2 tablespoons. This is 3 tablespoons of sugar, 3 tablespoons of oil, and 1.5 teaspoons of salt. Now, you may remember I said flour, water, salt, and yeast. We have 2 additional ingredients in this basic recipe. We have a little bit of sugar, we have a little bit of oil. I bet you know what the sugar is for. It is for the yeast to immediately have some food that it can start digesting and making that gas. So it increases the time, the speed of the proofing, of the rising of the bread. The oil helps the dough be a little bit more smooth. So I'm going to start with about 5 cups of flour. Now, because I have all the flour measured out here, I'm not particularly going to measure exactly. That's about 3, about 4, and about 5, and that's more than maybe a little bit more. Okay, so we start with our flour. Now, right now, this is flying in the face of what a lot of the methods are shown on the internet. But don't worry, we're going to get there, and we're going to get there faster. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the yeast and just sprinkle it right over the flour. And at this point, people who have been making bread for years and years in the standard way are thinking, what? You have to wet the yeast first. No, you don't. You don't at all. And then the other thing that I'm going to put in right now is the sugar. And I'm just going to put that right on the top. And then you can whip this with a little, one of these thingies. Right here, you could use this if you wanted. I don't want. I like to get into bread dough with my hands because my hands are my best data collector. I know what's happening if I get my hands in this. So I'm just mixing those dry ingredients with my hands. Notice I have not put the salt in yet. Okay, so this is all mixed in. You cannot even distinguish where the yeast is. Now I'm just going to scatter the salt along the top. And I'm just going to mix in a little bit at the top. Now, the next thing that comes is the water. 2.5 cups of water. Now, here's one of the nuances. Most instructions on the internet are going to tell you to get that water up to about 110 degrees. And I'm telling you, no, don't do that. We want it to be a lot lower. Now, if you don't have one of those fancy thermometers, use your wrist, because you can use your wrist. Your body temperature is 98.6. And so if it feels warm to your wrist, it's going to be warmer than 98.6. If it feels cooler to your wrist, it's going to be lower than that. We want it between about 85 and 90, somewhere in there. It gives a little bit slower fermentation process, which helps develop the flavor in the bread. That way you don't do it so fast that it skips this step. So a lot of you, I hear a lot about how much water I let go down the drain, and it's wasteful because water is precious, and it is. But I'm telling you right now that our water goes down this drain and straight out to our fruit trees, so it's not as bad as people think. So I learned the wrist method from my mother. She always used her wrist. And so, and then I'll double check it just to tell you. So it's feeling warm to my wrist, so I'm adding cool, cool, cool. Okay, now it's feeling not cold, but it's feeling a little bit cool to my wrist. Now it's a little cold. Now I can feel the water, but it feels pretty close to what my wrist is, maybe a little bit cool. That's exactly where you want it. So I'm just going to check the temperature to see where we are. 84 degrees. Perfect, perfect. So I'm going to just fill this container with 2.5 cups of water. All right, so we're good. Now, notice I still have some flour here. Because I'm starting with a lower amount, I want to see how much liquid this flour is going to absorb before I add more flour. I have used between 5.5 cups of flour and about 7 cups of flour for this recipe. Depends on the day, depends on the flour I'm using, and by depends on the day, I mean the temperature in the kitchen, the humidity in the kitchen, all of that. And that's what one of the important nuances is. Even though the recipe calls for a certain amount of flour, don't you pay attention to that. Start lower and then work in only what you need. So I'm dumping all of the water in here right now, every bit of it. And then with my wooden spoon, I'm just going to mix this in. I can already tell that, see, the liquid has almost been absorbed, and look how much flour I still have. So now I'm a little bit worried. We want a soft dough when we're done. We don't want a really stiff dough. It should feel about like, okay, so Jim and I talked about this last night. We were trying to come up with something that we could compare it to. And we kept throwing out ideas, Jell-O and cooked spaghetti and all kinds of things. And then Jim came up with the perfect thing. He said, marshmallow. It should feel soft like a marshmallow, a big old fluffy marshmallow. And that's exactly what we want. Okay, so this has absorbed a lot of the flour. So I'm going to set the wooden spoon aside, and I'm going to get my hands in there. Because with my hands, like I say, my hands are my best data collector. Now I want you to watch how I do this. So I'm grabbing underneath and pushing into the middle. Underneath and pushing into the middle. It almost looks like kneading, and it sort of is. And then every once in a while I'm going to stop and give it the caterpillar. See, I'm punching through like this in caterpillar segments. And then I'm going to, and this is the method that I learned to use with my artisan bread, and it works so beautifully. I decided to try it here, and it works beautifully here too. So again, the caterpillar, and then mixing and mixing, and it is a little bit sticky. See, my hands are now pulling it up. So I'm not sure I'm going to need much more of that other flour. So I put about 5 cups in here to start. I may be ending with that. It's going to take a little bit more. All right, just as soon as I get it to this point, I don't need the bowl anymore. So I'm going to set the bowl aside and set it out here on the counter. And I'm just going to sprinkle some flour because I want the dough now to take up the flour that it needs, because ideally what I want is to not have it sticky like this. It's not sticky like peanut butter. That's what it is about now. We don't want that. But I'm going to start the kneading process. Now, the reason that we manipulate the dough like this kneading process, is we are developing the gluten. And that gluten has to be completely developed. Okay, now I can tell that I don't want it to work in much more flour, because this is about right. This is about marshmallow. So that's about exactly what I want. But I have to work it. Now, here's the thing. A lot of people think that in order to get bread, the gluten all developed, you have to stay at it for 10-15 minutes doing the kneading. And that's why those stand mixers with the dough hooks became so popular, is because standing here doing this kneading for 10 or 15 minutes, boy, it can really work your arms. And you can get really tired. And by the way, there are lots of ways to knead. Don't think that because I do this way that is the only right way to knead. I've seen some people use one hand. I can't do one hand. This is the way I learned, and I've done it for 60 years, so it's a little hard for me to try to come up with something new. So I just bring the top to the center, and then with the heel of this hand, I push it forward. Now it's getting a tiny bit sticky again, and that's okay. So what if I needed a rest right now? So okay, flop it over, put the lid back on it, and go do something for 5 minutes. Go change the baby, go get the kids out of the street, or just go sit down on the couch for a few minutes. Because what's going to happen if you let it rest, you don't have to let it rest. I like it to rest, and I learned this from the other method that I use. The gluten is still developing because we've manipulated it some. Now we're letting it rest, and it's going to do its thing. It's still developing even though we're not moving that around. And one of the things that you will notice as you go is that the whole texture of the bread starts to change. So we'll be back in 5 minutes and I'll show you what we mean. It's been 5 minutes, so let's see what we've got. Now, 2 confessions. I moved this flour bag and found my little bowl of oil that I had not added. Now, if that happens to you, you can do one of 2 things. You can either just not add the oil and it won't hurt a thing. Your bread may be a little less smooth, and that's okay. Or what I did was I just flipped this over and I opened up the bread like this, and I dumped the oil in, and I just folded it back over and kneaded it in, and then it needed a little bit more flour. And so I have used a little bit more flour here, but now it's just fine. So I am going to knead this just a little bit more. And oh my goodness, it is so soft, just like a marshmallow, Jim. So here we go. It's really developing, and remember how kind of raggedy it looked at first, and now look how smooth it is. Nice smooth top, and it's just, oh, it's a perfect texture. And so, and I can tell that the gluten streams are being developed. So I'm going to just knead it a couple more minutes, and then we are ready for the next step. I could even let it rest again if I wanted to, but I don't. Okay, that's good enough. Now, I could use this bowl, but it would require washing it out. So because of we wanted to be efficient on the video, I'm using a different bowl. Now, I have put a little bit of oil in the bottom, and I just use canola oil. And I'm smearing it around, and it's a lot of oil, because here's what I want to do. I'm going to take our bread and I'm going to turn it the smooth side down, get that top all oiled, then flip it over like this, and we're going to let it have its first rise. Now, remember what's happening. The rice is digesting, not the rice, good grief. The yeast is digesting that sugar, starting it on the flour, producing a lot of carbon dioxide. So how much rising do we want this to have? A lot of recipes say double in size. Well, you can let it go that high. You don't need to. I let it go to about, maybe 75%. I was really surprised when I opened this new package of yeast. Usually this step takes between an hour and an hour and a half. And my gosh, in 30 minutes, it was ready. So this is another nuance. Watch the dough. If it says allow to rise until double for an hour and a half, that's conflicting information because we don't know if it's going to take an hour and a half. Again, it depends on the circumstances in your kitchen. So just watch it. And you don't want it to get you don't want it to overinflate because the yeast gets used up that way. So I'm going to stick a bag over it. I used to use tea towels over the top. I now have learned better. I cover it in plastic, and you can use like plastic wrap, cling wrap, or I just use grocery bags. And whoops, that one is a little small. And I just make sure that they don't have any holes in the bottom. And so we're just going to let this sit. Now, one more trick that I use. My counter is granite. It's cold. It's now proofing, and I don't want it on cold, so I put a level of air below it by putting it up on a rack. I could also put it over in the window where the sun is now streaming in, and that would speed it up just a little bit. I don't need to speed up this yeast. It's already plenty fast. So we're going to let this proof now, and we'll come back when it's ready, and I'll show you what to look for. It's been half an hour, so let's check. Okay, this just blows me away. I've never had it get to this stage so soon, so that's plenty risen enough. So it's nice and airy. You can probably see that from where you are. So let's get the next step. We're really on a roll right now. So I'm going to just flour this a little bit. Probably is going to take up a little more. And then I'm going to flour the top. When I dump it out, I want to be sure that, oh yeah, this is, I don't know if you can see how bubbly this is right here. See how light and airy that is? It's just beautiful. Now, the first thing that we need to do is to degas this. So I'm sort of forming this in a rectangle, and then I'm going to degas it. We need to get all that air out of there because we've got to start over on a second, pretty well degassed, but we're going to see, I'm sure we'll see more gas as we work with this. Now, how to shape a good loaf of bread is something that is really personal to some people. Don't mess with their method. I'm not one of those, and so you can shape it any way you want to. I will show you how I shape it, but if you have a favorite method already, then that's just fine. So I like a long rectangle. I'm seeing more bubbles, so I'm doing a little bit more degassing. Now the idea here, and to prevent bubbles on the finished product, you want this dough, as we're going to fold it here in just a minute, to be tightly packed together, so and then mashed a little bit. So that's what we're doing. I'm going to do this now in thirds. I fold this long edge over to the middle, and then I tack it to the middle. And then I fold the outside edge over and also tack it to the middle. And sometimes I'll even do a little bit like this, but this is plenty long. And then I fold it about the same length that will fit into the pan. So I have this little layer right here. Now, here's the trick on this. When I was making bread when my kids were at home, at this point I needed a karate chop. And so quite often I said, okay, who wants to karate chop the bread? And we had to take turns because it was kind of the highlight for the kids to do. And so what they would do is that they would just give it a good karate chop right here in the middle. And why they got so excited about that, I never know, but you know how things develop in families. Now, what we want to do is this lower level, we want to pull and stretch up. It's important that the top part of that loaf is stretched without breaking. So I'm going to pull that over, and with my thumbs I'm poking this other stuff on the inside. And again, I'm following the same thing where I'm bringing it halfway. And there's a little bubble I'm going to pop. And then the same thing to the other side. I want that outside edge stretched up and over the top, and it's like I'm stitching this together right here on the bottom. And this has worked for me for 30 years. It might not work for you, so some people just roll it up tightly. Now, on my pan, even though this is a no-stick pan, I always put Crisco in the bottom. And now, I'm putting it in here, and you can see that the mass has been evenly distributed, so there should not be those lumps and bumps on the top. But there's a bubble I'm going to get. Okay, so that one is pretty good. We'll set that aside and we'll work on this one. Same thing, I'll go faster. Degassing a little bit more. Folding in thirds, bring it to the half and punch it in. Bring the other side to the half, punch it in. Do a little stretch and pull. If I feel more mass like there is right down here, I might do a little bit like this to kind of get it all straightened out. Then fold it to the middle, this way, about the same size as the pan. Just redistribute the mass if I need to. Karate chop. And then stretch this outside layer, the bottom layer, all the way around all of this other, making sure not to break the dough, but rather to stretch the dough around to the center. Same thing on this side, stretching, stretching, pulling across the top. This is too long for my pan. So I have a fatter end down here, so I'm just going to kind of bunch this end up, add a little mass here by shoving it in. Wanting to be sure I get a good distribution. Top looks pretty good. Bubble. And put it in the pan. And second proof right here in the plastic. We'll come back and check in a half an hour, and I will show you how to determine whether or not it's ready to go in the oven, if it is proofed enough. And it's a simple little test. I think you'll love it. So we'll see you back here as soon as these are ready to go in the oven. I wanted this to be perfect, and it isn't. I can show you right now that this is overproofed just a little bit. I had to wait for the darn oven to preheat, and so it is overproofed. You can see that it's tearing, pulling apart there, and it's pulling apart right here. Also, this is a little bit higher. It's going to be fine in terms of taste, but I wanted it to be a perfect example. But just know that bread making involves this kind of thing, and you just keep trying until you get it done. Here's how we know that it is ready to go into the oven to see if it is proofed enough. You just poke your finger in about 1/2 inch. If that pops out slowly, the way that one is right now, it is ready. But if it pops back out, immediately you know that it still has some time to go. Now ordinarily I would give it another 5 minutes for that to come back all the way out. I don't have time to do that because this is already overproofed. So we're going to put it in the oven at 375, and we're not going to open that oven for 20 minutes. And then we're going to check it 20 minutes just to kind of see how it's doing visually, and then we're going to give it another 20 minutes. So I'll see you back when this is done. Just took these out of the oven and I couldn't wait any longer. I had to get them out. So I just took them out of the pan. Some people will say keep them in the pan for a minute. Don't do that because it softens your crust, and I like a crunchy crust. So these turned out really well, I think, in spite of the fact that the tops are broken a little bit. They pulled apart. But notice that I can't pick these up, they're too hot. But notice the seam right here is perfect. There's no pulling and separating. Same right here. Now these are two different sizes. If I would have weighed out the dough to have two equal pieces, that would have been fine. This, and I could tell when I was shaping it, this had a little bit more mass than this one did. This is not yeast that has failed because it still has a nice curved top to it. I'm trying to find the place where I poked my finger in so we can see if it left a defect. Looks like it did pretty well. Yeah, it could be that bubble right there. And here's where I put the thermometer in. And so these turned out beautifully. Now, a lot of people like to put butter on the top. I've done that before. That softens the crust. I've gotten to the point where I really like the crunchy crust. So we're just going to let these cool for a few minutes. Then I'm going to open up one and we'll take a look at the crumb, and then we will wrap up this video. So these have cooled now for about 20 minutes, and I wasn't able to show you the bottom side because they were still so hot, but the bottoms on both of these look just really wonderful. And so they turned out really well. I'm going to go ahead and cut into this one because it's the larger one. So we'll see what the crumb looks like here. Okay, so here we have the crumb, and there is a little flaw right there. That happened when we did the folding. So if we're using this for toast, the butter and the raspberry jam is going to drip through. But I can tell already that if we go in this far, it will be okay. So this turned out pretty well. What I really love about this is that the crumb is bouncing back beautifully, and so it is done all the way through and into the middle. These were both tested. Well, this one was tested because it was the larger one at 200. So I think we've had a pretty successful time, and just know that even as experienced a person as I am with more than 60 years, it never always turns out perfectly, but it is perfectly delicious. And it works perfectly within our families as well. So this is part one. For part two, which will happen in a couple of weeks, I'm going to show you how we can do half wheat, half white, and how that turns out in terms of baking bread that is also really delicious. So we will see you at our next videos next week, which are going to be pretty cool, I think. And I'll be posting an advance notice on our Facebook page so that you will know what we're going to be doing next time. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you soon.